Under the unforgiving heat of the Arizona desert lies a world few outside its walls ever truly understand. Behind the razor wire and concrete barriers of the state's prisons exists a hidden empire, a network of loyalty, violence, and control known as the Mexican Mafia. In Arizona, they call it La EMA. It is smaller than its California counterpart, but no less ruthless. For decades, the Arizona Mexican Mafia has ruled the yards with an iron grip, shaping lives and deaths through whispered orders and silent gestures. What began as a means of protection for Hispanic inmates evolved into a shadow government within the prison system, one that extends its influence far beyond the cell blocks and into the neighborhoods of Phoenix, Tucson, and Tolleson. Among the names whispered in that violent underworld is Raymond Oso Montano. To some, he was another inmate, just one of thousands serving time in Arizona's overcrowded prisons. But to others, he represented something more, a soldier loyal to La EMA, part of a lineage of men who lived and died under its command. The name Oso, meaning bear, fit the man well, quiet, broad-shouldered, and watchful. He wasn't the type to draw attention, but those who knew him understood that his silence carried weight. In a place where words could get you killed, Montaño spoke through actions. The Arizona Department of Corrections had long struggled to contain the reach of the Mexican Mafia. Though confined within prison walls, its members orchestrated extortion rackets, drug trafficking, and enforcement hits. Orders were passed in coded letters known as kites, or through loyal couriers disguised as friends, girlfriends, or family members. The EMA's presence could be felt in every aspect of prison life, from who controlled the commissary trades to who was allowed to walk freely in certain yards. The guards knew it, the inmates lived it, and everyone, from the newest convict to the most senior officer, understood one unspoken rule. Crossing La EMA could mean death. In the early 2000s, Arizona's prisons became pressure cookers of gang tension. Rival groups fought for scraps of influence, while La EMA consolidated power by eliminating threats, often through intimidation or staged violence. The prisons at Florence, Amon, and Lewis became strongholds, each housing inmates loyal to the EMA's cause. Within this environment, Raymond Oso Montano found his place. His name began to circulate quietly among the prison population, not for loud displays of aggression, but for his reputation as someone who followed the gang's code to the letter. Loyalty, obedience, silence. The power structure of La EMA was as intricate as any organized crime family. At the top were the Carnals, brothers, the fully initiated members who made decisions, issued orders, and collected taxes from street gangs on the outside. Beneath them were soldiers like Montaño, tasked with enforcement and maintaining discipline. Even the smallest act of defiance could invite deadly retribution. To the EMA, order was everything. A single act of disrespect, a rumor of cooperation with authorities, or a failure to pay tribute could trigger what inmates called a green light, an order to kill. Prison staff often spoke about the eerie calm that settled before a hit. Sometimes there was no warning at all. A man could be alive and talking one day and gone the next, found hanging in his cell, stabbed in the shower, or slumped over in the yard. Official reports might list the cause of death as suicide or heart failure, but among the inmates, everyone knew what it really meant. The EMA had spoken. As the years passed, the Arizona Mexican Mafia's reputation for calculated violence grew. The gang's influence was so pervasive that even administrative segregation, solitary confinement, couldn't fully isolate its members. Through coded phone calls and letters filtered through intermediaries, Orders continued to flow. The prison system became not a barrier to their operations, but a command center. And for men like Montaño, it was both battlefield and home. By 2009, the Arizona Department of Corrections was grappling with a rise in inmate deaths that seemed to defy explanation. Some were straightforward, fights, stabbings, drug overdoses, but others were not so clear. Among these was the death of an inmate named Calleros, found hanging in his cell. The initial report declared it a suicide. The scene appeared consistent. A sheet tied to the vent, a lifeless body swaying in the stale air. Yet within days, whispers began circulating among the prison population, whispers that reached investigators and eventually the outside world. They said Calleros hadn't killed himself. They said he had been green-lighted. And the name tied to those whispers was Raymond Oso Montano. It was an early morning in 2009 when guards at an Arizona state prison began their routine head count. The corridors were quiet except for the sound of keys clinking and the echo of boots on concrete. As the officers approached one of the cells, they stopped. Inside, an inmate named Calleros hung lifeless from a bedsheet tied to the air vent above his bunk. His body swayed slightly, the stillness of death settling over the tier. The officers shouted for medical assistance, but it was already too late. Within minutes, the scene was secured and investigators began their work. The official report would later describe it as an apparent suicide. It wasn't the first in that unit, and it wouldn't be the last. But behind the quiet paperwork and standard procedures, a different story was taking shape. Word spread quickly among the inmates that Calleros hadn't taken his own life. Within the unwritten laws of the Arizona prison system, rumors carry weight, and soon those whispers grew into something darker. That Calleros had been green-lighted by the Mexican Mafia. To those familiar with the code, the phrase meant death had been ordered. A hit had been sanctioned by the higher-ups of La EMA, carried out by loyal soldiers within the walls. And according to one confidential informant, the man who had done the choking, the man who had made it look like a hanging, was Raymond Oso Montano. The story the informant told investigators was both detailed and chilling. Calleros, he claimed, had fallen out of favor with La EMA. Whether it was over a drug debt, an insult, or an accusation of cooperation with the authorities, no one could say for sure. But in the world of prison politics, reasons hardly mattered once the green light was given. Orders trickled down the hierarchy, from a colonel in another unit to a soldier, and finally to those chosen to carry it out. According to the informant, Montaño was one of them. He was seen near Calleros' cell before count time, quiet and composed. Later that night, the informant said, the hit went down. Calleros was choked until he stopped moving, then hung by the bedsheet to stage the scene. By morning, it looked like suicide. When investigators reviewed the claim, the details seemed plausible. Too plausible to ignore. The informant identified Montaño by name and inmate number, even describing his movements on the night in question. Yet, for every piece of information, there was a problem. There were no witnesses willing to testify in person, no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints to connect Montaño or anyone else to the act. The coroner's report supported suicide, noting ligature marks consistent with self-hanging. Without hard proof, the case was impossible to prosecute. Inside the prison, however, the story refused to die. Guards and inmates alike knew that staged suicides were part of the Mexican Mafia's playbook. It was a clean way to remove a target without leaving obvious traces. A prison investigator, speaking years later under anonymity, described it simply, "If the EMA wants someone gone, they make it look quiet." No screaming, no blood, no chaos. Just another dead man hanging for the Arizona Department of Corrections. Such deaths were a nightmare to investigate. Cameras covered only certain areas, and cell interiors were rarely monitored. Even when suspicions arose, gathering evidence behind prison walls was like chasing smoke. Every inmate had an agenda. Every statement carried risk. Those who talked could end up in protective custody, or worse. The informant who had named Montaño was eventually transferred, his credibility questioned. To this day, it's unclear whether he was telling the truth or simply trying to gain favor with investigators. Montaño, for his part, denied nothing and admitted nothing. He understood the code. Silence was survival. In the world of La M, to even respond to an accusation could be seen as weakness. The less said, the safer you were. His file would later note only that he had been identified by a confidential source as possibly involved in the death of inmate Calleros. No charges were ever filed. Officially, the case was closed. Yet inside those walls, men remembered. They remembered the calm expression on Montaño's face during the days that followed. The way he walked the yard as if nothing had happened. In the unwritten ledger of the prison underworld, that calm was proof enough. Whether guilty or not, he had earned a reputation, the kind that carries both fear and respect. For investigators on the outside, the Calleros case became another example of how power operates within the Arizona prison system. The Mexican Mafia didn't need weapons to enforce its will. It needed loyalty and silence. Every death that went unpunished, every informant who disappeared, reinforced that authority. And for men like Raymond Oso Montano, that silence was the ultimate armor, a shield that the justice system could not penetrate. The official paperwork might have ended with a single word: suicide. But among the inmates, the truth was passed quietly from cell to cell. They said Calleros had been hit. They said Montaño was the one who did it. And in the eyes of La EMA, that made him a man who could be trusted. The story of Raymond Oso Montano and the death of Calleros is just one thread in a much larger web, a network that stretches across Arizona's prisons and into the streets beyond. To understand what happened in that cell, you have to understand the power that fuels it. The Arizona Mexican Mafia, known to its members as La EMA de Arizona. Born from the chaos of prison life, this organization is not simply a gang. It is an institution, a government behind bars, complete with rules, ranks, and a bloody code of conduct that has endured for decades. The Arizona Mexican Mafia began taking shape in the late 1970s and early 1980s, at a time when Latino inmates in state prisons were divided by geography, neighborhood, and smaller street gangs. Outnumbered by rival groups and often targeted by white supremacist organizations, these inmates formed alliances for survival. Over time, those alliances hardened into a unified brotherhood modeled after the original Mexican Mafia in California. But Arizona's version developed its own culture, one less about legacy and more about control. It operated under a single idea: power is survival, and survival demands obedience. By the 1990s, the Arizona EMA had infiltrated nearly every level of the state's correctional system. It taxed drug sales inside and outside prison, extorted inmates for protection, and managed a communication network that spanned from Florence and Iman to the urban sprawl of Phoenix, Mesa, and Tolleson. The gang's leaders, known as carnales, directed operations even while serving life sentences. They issued green lights, collected tribute, and dictated terms to street gangs that answered to them. Gangs that acted as their soldiers and suppliers in the outside world. Raymond Oso Montano came from Tolleson, a small city in the western part of the Phoenix metro area, one known for its working-class roots and strong gang presence. To those familiar with EMA's history, it was no surprise that members from Tolleson carried influence. The streets there had long served as a recruiting ground for the Arizona Mexican Mafia's ranks, a place where loyalty to one's neighborhood often blurred into loyalty to La EMA. Over time, Montaño's name became associated with this lineage, a Tolleson native who had earned his place inside the organization's prison faction. Through interviews with law enforcement officers and former inmates, the documentary paints a picture of how men like Montaño fit into the system. Not everyone in La M is a shot caller or leader. Some are enforcers, the quiet, dependable soldiers who carry out orders without question. They don't seek recognition. Their worth is measured in silence and execution. To the organization, men like Montaño are essential, the invisible gears that keep its violent machine running. Experts describe how the EMA's communication network has evolved over time. In earlier decades, orders moved through handwritten kites and coded phrases etched in letters. But by the 2000s, the methods changed. Contraband cell phones, smuggled in through visitors or corrupt staff, allowed imprisoned members to maintain near constant contact with the streets. The gang's influence grew stronger even as the state tried to isolate its leaders. Inside, members spoke in code. Outside, they used social media. It's here that Montaño's name surfaces again. In June 2025, a social media post referred to him simply as an EMA member. Another in October of the same year identified him as a member from Tolleson, Arizona. These weren't official declarations, but in the world of organized crime, even a casual mention can speak volumes. Publicly associating with La M is not something done lightly. It signals allegiance, respect, and sometimes power. Law enforcement monitors these online whispers closely. Digital footprints have become the new lifeblood of gang intelligence. A retired Arizona gang investigator describes it plainly. They've adapted. The communication has gone digital, but the message is the same. The Mexican Mafia still runs the show. The post identifying Montaño as an EMA member confirmed that, even years after the Calleros incident, his name still carried the weight of that shadowed brotherhood. Yet, for all its structure and secrecy, La M is not immune to decay. Internal rivalries, betrayals, and shifting alliances have splintered its ranks over the years. Some members have turned informant, seeking to save themselves from death sentences or to escape the endless cycle of violence. Others have been killed by their own, condemned for breaking the code. Still, the organization endures. Every time one leader falls, another steps forward. The institution itself, fed by loyalty and fear, survives like a ghost that cannot die. Within this framework, Montaño's story is not unique. He represents hundreds of men who entered the prison system as inmates and emerged as soldiers of a larger cause. Some are born into gang culture, others are shaped by it once they're locked behind bars. In the Arizona system, joining La M can mean protection, respect, or even a sense of belonging in a place built to strip all three away. But membership comes with a price: absolute obedience. Once you're in, there is no leaving. As the documentary delves deeper into this world, it becomes clear that the death of Calleros was not an isolated event, but part of a recurring pattern. Inmate deaths, labeled suicides, have long raised quiet suspicions among both guards and prisoners. The details differ, but the stories are the same. A man marked for death, found hanging in his cell, the case quietly closed. Officially, no one can prove anything. Unofficially, everyone knows what happened. Experts refer to these incidents as ghost hits, killings hidden in plain sight, disguised as acts of self-harm. They leave no fingerprints, no blood trails, no confessions. They leave only rumors, which in prison can be as dangerous as truth itself. In that sense, Montaño's alleged involvement in Calleros' death fits perfectly within La EMA's methods. Whether he did it or not almost becomes irrelevant. What matters is that others believe he could have. Reputation in this world is currency. Time moves differently inside prison walls. Years blur into one another, faces come and go, and the stories of the dead fade from memory, except among those who live by the code. For Raymond Oso Montano, the years following the death of Calleros passed quietly, but his name never disappeared from the conversation. Within Arizona's prison yards, silence can speak louder than confession. The fact that Montaño never addressed the allegations, never broke the code, and never showed fear only deepened the aura that surrounded him. Whether he was a killer, a loyal soldier, or just another inmate caught in the machinery of La EMA, no one could say with certainty. But his name remained, whispered in the corners of cells and in the coded chatter of the Arizona underworld. By 2025, more than a decade after the Calleros case had been officially closed, traces of Montaño surfaced again, this time outside the confines of prison paperwork. Social media posts began appearing, referencing him by name, calling him an EMA member from Tolleson, Arizona. To outsiders, these online mentions might have seemed insignificant, but for those familiar with the culture of organized crime, they carried meaning. A name associated with La EMA is a declaration of identity, one that binds a man to a legacy of violence and loyalty that few ever escape. For some, it is a badge of honor. For others, it is a curse. The digital age has changed many things, but the reach of the Mexican mafia remains remarkably intact. Investigators in Arizona monitor these online breadcrumbs, aware that social media has become both a recruiting tool and a status platform for incarcerated and affiliated members. The posts about Montaño served as a quiet reminder that the Arizona EMA was still alive and adapting. Even as law enforcement increased its scrutiny, the gang found new ways to communicate, organize, and project its power. The same structure that once relied on handwritten letters now thrives through encrypted messages and coded online language. The empire that began in prison yards continues to evolve in the digital shadows. But behind these traces of continued influence lies a deeper question. What does loyalty mean in a world built on fear? Men like Raymond Oso Montano embody a paradox. Within the prison hierarchy, silence and obedience are virtues. They are what separate survivors from the dead. Yet that same silence hides truths that may never be known. Truths about who gave the order, who carried it out, and who was left to bear the blame. The death of Calleros remains a mystery, preserved in a tangle of rumor and silence. Officially, it was suicide. Unofficially, it was something else, something darker, whispered about, but never proven. For correctional officers and investigators who've spent their careers in Arizona's prisons, the Calleros case represents a familiar kind of frustration. They know how power moves behind those walls, invisible, untraceable, and absolute. They've seen cases like it before. Bodies found hanging, the files stamped suicide, the whispers pointing elsewhere. The evidence is almost always circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable. Inmates fear retribution, and those who talk often vanish into protective custody or meet violent ends. As one retired officer put it, you can't solve a crime in a place where everyone's afraid to admit it happened. Even among inmates, the truth becomes fluid. Some cling to the official story, others accept the underground version as gospel. The line between fact and legend fades over time, replaced by a mythology that sustains the gang's power. In that mythology, Montaño becomes more than a man. He becomes a symbol. Whether guilty or innocent, his name carries the weight of the EMA's authority, the echo of 1,000 unspoken rules. He is part of a system where silence is not just protection, but currency. As the years pass, the violence continues. Reports of inmate deaths still surface from Arizona's prisons, some clearly murders, others ruled suicides with suspicious details. Each new case reopens the old questions. How many of these deaths are really what they seem? How many are messages, warnings, or internal corrections ordered from within the Brotherhood? The Calleros case might have been buried in paperwork, but its pattern endures, repeated in cells across the state.